Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for March 1st, 2024. Today is Friday, so I'm going to be taking your questions and comments. We've had a lot of responses from yesterday from the update I posted emphasizing the importance of the courage demonstrated by Brazil's President Lula da Silva in his statement that he will not remain silent in the face of genocide. This obviously struck a chord. The number of views on the YouTube site are way up. These are important updates and should be shared, but let me go back into the bigger question here of what was the importance of what Lula did. Now, it's clear there are many others who are speaking up as well. But with Lula, it was most direct and most polemical, because what he said is that what Israel is doing, what Netanyahu is doing, and he personalized it. He pointed to Netanyahu directly. But what Netanyahu is doing in his argument that he's defending the security of Israel is adopting the policy of the Nazis toward Jews in his policy toward the Palestinians. That is, wiping out a population, ethnic cleansing, identifying a whole population and using collective punishment against them. When in fact, the argument could be made that the attack from Gaza on October 7th was minimally facilitated by Netanyahu's failed security regime, but even possibly was allowed by Netanyahu as an excuse to carry out what he and his extreme right-wing ideological cabinet members, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and others, had intended for a long time, which is to drive the Palestinian population out of Gaza. Now, what's important about what Lula did is that it comes at a time where many, many other nations are taking a stand against genocide. There were more than 50 nations which testified at the International Court of Justice demanding action to stop the attacks on the people of Gaza and to implement the provisional measures against the killing that the International Court of Justice issued. Now, it's clear that the one government which could do something to stop this is the United States. The Biden administration, if it really does have a concern for the slaughter of civilians in Gaza, that the U.S. could stop it by cutting off arms, by cutting off funding, by cutting off political support for Netanyahu's policy. So far, it's not doing that. What good is it to have Blinken stare into a camera and say how sad he is about the situation, and then the next moment send more weapons to the Israelis? So more voices must be heard. Keep in mind that as I mentioned at the outset, the war hawks are on an offensive. Macron talked about putting boots on the ground, NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. And he said this at a meeting of NATO member states, and no one spoke up against it. The boots on the ground, we need to put boots on the ground in cities throughout the global north, throughout the Western world, to contest this idiocy. In the age of nuclear weapons, war is not an option. And you can talk about how Putin is making threats. Well, Putin has tried consistently to use diplomacy and been rejected by the West. Now, let me give you an example, because I had several questions from people asking, what do I make of the New York Times article about the CIA setting up shop in Ukraine, not after 2022, but in 2014. In other words, at the time of the Maidan coup, the color revolution regime change coup run by Biden, Obama, Victoria Nuland, George Soros, and so on. Now, the article is less an expose than actually laying out a blueprint for what the U.S. policy is, at least the administration policy of the war hawks is for Ukraine, which is continued war. The article pointed out very usefully that this began in 2014. And so when Putin said he was trying to negotiate an alternative to a confrontation going back to the time of the Maidan coup, remember, what was the coup about? It was to overthrow a democratically elected government of Ukraine to impose a government that would become a part of NATO. That was the intention behind the operation. And a government not neutral, but one which is heavily influenced by the neo-Nazi strain of Banderism, which goes back to the World War II collaboration of Ukrainian so-called nationalists with the Nazis. Now, you look at this and you then read the article that the CIA has set up 12 bases inside Ukraine, as close to the Russian border as they can get. To do what? To coordinate with Ukraine activity, military activity, subversion activity, warfare against Russia. Now, this article should point to the idiocy of those people who say Putin's special military operation was unprovoked. Of course it was provoked. Not only was there no negotiation, was there no attempt to stop the shelling going into the Donbas region, was there no effort to contain the venom of the Ukrainian neo-Nazi faction around the Pravi sector, the right sector, and so on. But there was a commitment, as Merkel and Hollande admitted, to use the fake negotiations around the Minsk Accord to build up Ukraine as a military force against Russia. So if you hear someone say it was unprovoked, you have to look them in the eye and ask them, how stupid could they be? Do they ignore history? Do they ignore troop movements? Ask them this: what would the US response be if the Russian secret services set up 12 bases on the Mexican border to coordinate guerrilla activity and warfare activity into the United States? What would the US do? Have we forgotten the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where John Kennedy brought the world to the edge of nuclear war to stop the Soviet use of Cuba as a base against the United States? But what was the lesson for Kennedy? Negotiate, open channels of diplomacy. And that's what the Biden administration, the NATO countries, Boris Johnson, that's what they failed to learn. And when they say Russia must submit, they're missing the point, which is that it's NATO which has provoked this. And the war is continuing, with the US now at about a $1 trillion a year defense expenditure, while people are homeless, with the industry is being shut down, and so on. So the lesson of this is we need statesmen who step forward with a commitment to diplomacy and against the lunacy of the ideological war hawks and neocons. Excuse me. Now, I have another question. Why is Germany so committed to war? Because it's clear the Germans just have increased their defense budget significantly. They're talking about more weapons to Ukraine, and so on. You have Pistorius, the defense minister, who said Germany must become war ready. And the Greens, who actually had their origin in the anti-war movement in the 1980s, are now the most vociferous proponents of war. But that's not surprising. As the LaRouche movement has always said, green ideology is an anti-human ideology. And now one of the ways they clearly are talking about reducing population is through war. How else can you explain the inane statements coming from the lips of Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, or the anti-industry policies of Habeck, the so-called economics minister of Germany? You have calls for even placing nuclear weapons in Europe and Germany. The EU is supporting, escalating the support for Ukraine. We have NATO expansion with Sweden and Finland being brought in. The sanctions, the destruction of the Nord Sea pipeline, step by step by step, escalation from the West, not by Putin. Putin has been reacting to that. So who's been hurt by these policies? The people of Germany. The price of electricity for German homeowners has gone up 41% since 2021. Why? Sanctions, green policy, the shutdown of cheap Russian oil and gas. As a result, we're seeing farm protests. We're even beginning to see German industrialists protest as the industry in Germany is being shut down. Now, one potentially positive sign is that Chancellor Scholz, who up to this point has been a wet rag being pushed around by the NATO hierarchy, Scholz came out and said there will be no German troops deployed in Ukraine and no Taurus long-range missiles. Now, he was attacked by the Greens for not being sufficiently subservient to NATO's war plans. But I think that's partly in response to the fact that German farmers have marched across all the towns and villages and cities in Germany, that protests continue to go beyond the farm sector. And what's beginning to occur is they're making the point that the enemy of the people of Germany is not the Russian people, is not Putin, but the ideologues in the coalition government in Germany and the war hawks in the NATO hierarchy in Brussels. Just one note on the Nord Stream pipeline. The governments that were supposedly investigating the sabotage, the explosions, have now closed down the investigations with no indication that they have found who's responsible. Well, I think Seymour Hersh found who was responsible. It was the Biden administration acting on behalf of NATO war hawks to make sure that Germany would not reopen the pipelines and submit to supposedly Putin's pressure. Instead, Germany lay on its back and allowed the West to turn Germany into a recession-driven, collapsed economy on behalf of this war drive. Now, let me take a question from another, actually several people said that they considered my linking of the Aaron Bushnell self-immolation in front of the Israeli embassy to be something to be commended. And they said, well, suicide shows a sign of sickness. It's not something that should be supported. Well, the question is not to support him or not support him, but to recognize that he made a personal decision, a choice of conscience, that he said he would not stand for the U.S. being complicit in genocide in Gaza. And given that these voices are being silenced, that there's censorship, that the Congress is gung-ho for the war in Gaza, he may have felt there was no other recourse. That was a personal decision. I was not commending that people follow his example, except to recognize that people must make personal decisions in the face of this kind of atrocity that's going underway. We must each make personal choices. Find your own way to express your opposition to the war hawks. Lyndon LaRouche often spoke of the tradition of Gandhi, of Martin Luther King, of Mandela, of nonviolent protest. We're seeing this throughout the world today with the Global South moving against the weaponization of the dollar and the destruction of their economies through neo-colonial policies. That's good. The emergence of an alternative to the dollar system reflects the extent to which much of the world is rejecting the policy of the neocons and the neolibs of the new empire, the unipolar order. So the point here is not to go out and set yourself on fire, but to find your own means of personal expression. Don't remain silent. Now, in that context, let me come to the last question that came in. What can I do? How can I become a part of this movement? I'm going to be attaching links to the websites of two campaigns of candidates who are examples of American political figures standing up against the war hawks and the neocons. And these are the campaigns of longtime LaRouche activist Diane Sayre, who's running as an independent for Senate in New York, and of Jose Vega, the example of an interventionist who has decided that he will try to bring his style of intervention politics to the US Congress, running for the Congress from the Bronx. I'm linking these for you to give you a sense of what kind of activity is possible in an election year. Independent campaigns, outside of the mainstream, speaking truth to power. That's what is needed today. That's what was demonstrated by Lula da Silva. And that's what is called upon, what each of us is called upon to do in our own way, to demonstrate that we still have a human conscience and that we will not tolerate war for the sake of corporate cartels, the defense sector, the financial sector, the global corporatists, that we today have learned the lessons of history and will put ourselves forward on the march toward a new paradigm. So thanks for joining me this week. Take a look at those websites. Also, share this video and the other videos on the LaRoucheOrganization.com website. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche Organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.